We've been walking through this sermon series together since the beginning of the year. Beginning in 2024, we've just kind of decided to refocus on our mission, our purpose, our core values here as a church family. Every church has a language that just adopts to their culture. Not that one's better than the other necessarily, but the way that we've expressed our mission as a local body here as a church is a phrase that we've been unpacking and kind of re-exploring in a fresh way again this year. So I'm going to ask you to say it with me. What's our mission, church? Guiding people to life change in Jesus. And we are not about performance or grading people, but that was really soft. So we're going to try that again because I'm judging you just a skosh. And I said the word skosh, I think, for the first time in my life. All right, so church, what's our mission? Guiding people to life change in Jesus. We've so experienced in the person of Jesus Christ a change in our lives that we can't help but invite other people to experience the same thing. That we've been invited as broken people to experience healing. Those of us who've said, man, I walked through a season of addiction and I'm experiencing freedom in Jesus Christ. I've walked through seasons of despair and I have found hope in Jesus. He continues to set me free from the things that used to define me. There's life change in Jesus that we just got to invite other people to walk with us towards. That's who Jesus is. And if you could just experience him, if you could just experience, and it doesn't mean that he changes our life to where it's all like magical fairy tales and unicorns and whatever. Like life's still rough, man, but it's just different. It's just different. And matter of fact, it's some of those hard things that help us experience more of who Jesus is. And we trust him more and we're changed a little more to become a little more like him. And the way we've expressed this language of what this looks like is that we're invited to know God intimately. And as we know God, these are our core values, they're going to be up on the screen. As we know God intimately, we can't help but love him. We will love God. And as we love God, we can't help but share the story of God with everybody we come in contact with and around the world. And we don't do that alone. It's not it is a personal relationship with Jesus, but it's not a private relationship with Jesus. We do that as we connect with each other. That's been our core language. And we've been focused the last several weeks on the idea of sharing God intentionally, strategically, around the world. Thankful for David and Jennifer Hickson last week as they shared their update. They've given their whole lives over to sharing God. They started out as a young couple in student ministry, sharing God with the next generation, eventually in pastoral ministry, actually here in Fort Worth. And then God called them to go share God at the Noah's Ark Children's Home in Jamaica. And now they're going to share God in Southern Europe, working among unreached people groups with national pastors. An extraordinary thing. And we renewed our annual global missions faith promise commitments to support partners like this who are serving God around the world. But when it comes to like me and you, like when it comes to life on a Tuesday, what's special about Tuesday? Nothing, that's the point. When it comes to life on Tuesday, what does it actually look like for us to share God with the whole world? Does that feel a little intimidating for a normal Tuesday? Like, what does that really look like? I'm thrilled this morning to introduce to you a concept about how we share God that has revolutionized the way I see how we reach our little world. The reality is God's called us to partner with people who are sharing God around the world, but he actually hasn't called you to share God with the whole world because he doesn't set his kids up for failure. So if you're supposed to reach 8 billion people with the gospel, man, you better get to work, bro. Like, we got a lot of ground to cover. The reality is that there's a concept that I'm thrilled to introduce you to this morning and over the next several weeks. And really, I'm introducing you to a person, an incredible man of God. I've mentioned his name a couple times over the last 2 years. His name is Tom Mercer. Those of you who've known us for a long time have heard me talk a lot about Tom Messer. So now there's 2 old Toms in my life. Man, I hope somebody sends Messer that clip that I just said that. Tom Messer is from Jacksonville, Florida. He was my pastor. He was the president of the Christian Academy that Maurice and I graduated from, the chancellor of the college where I did my undergrad. He helped officiate our wedding. Like, he's been a mentor for a long, long time. Tom Mercer is from the opposite coast. He's from California, High Desert Church, just retired. He experienced this idea that I'm going to begin to introduce to you today when he was a very young student pastor about 50 years ago. And it's become his life's mantra, and I am geeked to get to share with you what I've been learning from this incredible man of God. Grab your Bible. If you don't have a Bible, there's one underneath the seat in front of you. And if you're a guest today, we'll invite you to join with us in our tradition. We hold up our Bibles and say a creed that we're going to say louder than we said our mission statement. Here, let's go. Let's declare this today. The Bible is the Word of God. The truth of the Bible will change my life. Lord, open my heart and awaken my mind and give me grace to respond. Change me for your glory and my joy. Amen. Thank you so much, and turn to Mark chapter 5. The Gospel of Mark chapter 5. If you're using one of those Bibles from the seat in front of you, it is page 789. 789. Mark chapter 5. Before we get to Mark chapter 5, let me just tell you kind of how chapter 4 starts. In the beginning of Mark chapter 4, it's one of those chapters that Mark really slows down because he's like bouncing from topic to topic pretty quick if you've read the Gospel of Mark. But he parks on a whole day where Jesus is gathered by the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd gets so big that Jesus ends up getting into a boat by the edge of the water. And from the boat, he teaches this crowd, this massive crowd that is gathered on the shore. And he gives one of the most important parables in the beginning of that talk. He talks about the 4 different kinds of soil. If you're familiar with the teachings of Jesus, I wish we could unpack that, but we got to move really quick. At the end of him teaching about some parables and why he does parables, we come to kind of the end of chapter 4 in verse number 35, and it says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, to his disciples, let us go across to the other side. That context is important for us to understand our call to share the story of God in our moment and in our generation. Because here's what was on the other side. What was on the other side was the Decapolis. So think about a decade or a decathlon. Deca is 10. Polis, like a population. That would be like where we get the word city from, right? So the Decapolis is a region that has 10 cities. Why does that matter? Because as the people of God, that was a region you did everything in your power to avoid. You did everything in your power, if you were a good Jewish follower of God, to not go anywhere near the Decapolis. Here's why. Rewind your brain to Sunday school as a kid when you're learning about the 12 spies who went in to spy in the promised land, and God finally brings them into the promised land after disobedience, after years of wandering. They come in, God's chosen people come into God's chosen real estate, the land of Canaan. And God's real clear, you got to drive the culture out so that you can guard the worship of the one true God. And so there's 7 nations that made up the culture of Canaan that were all pagan. They were anti the one true God. They were not just not aligned, they were opposed to the things of God. And there was rampant sexual immorality as the common practice of these 7 nations. These 7 nations get driven out by the people of God, and those cultures went and moved in among those 10 cities that make up the Decapolis. These are the people that were driven out of Canaan. And sure enough, they took their culture with them. This area is known for pagan, occultic worship. It is known for rampant sexual immorality. And as a Jewish person, if that weren't bad enough, it was like the headquarters of that region for the Roman Empire. There was in the Decapolis a Roman legion of soldiers. Everybody say the word legion. There's a legion of soldiers, which is 6,000 well-armed, well-resourced Roman military officers. And so if I'm a Jewish person, I'm being oppressed by the Roman Empire. These people are anti-God. These people are sexually immoral, and it's celebrated. And by the way, the oppressors that are oppressing us have a military hub in this region. And if that weren't bad enough, I need you to think Jewish for just a minute. Every legion had their own symbol. Their symbol was a boar's head, a pig's head. on their shields, and all over the city was the symbol of a pig, which is a Jewish person, is the most unclean of the unclean animals. And amazingly, in the Decapolis, they actually, worshipped pigs. Some of you were like, dude, I really love bacon, but I don't think I've ever worshiped it. The actual worship of pigs. So this is a place they did everything in their power to avoid, and this is where we're going to be introduced into how God intends to reach every man, woman, and child with the hope of the gospel. That even in a culture that's opposed to truth, even in a culture that doesn't view sexual ethics the way that God does, he's inviting the hope of the gospel into those places. Even in the places that politically might not align with our faith system, God's inviting the gospel to be declared in those places. The fact that they went to the other side matters. Tom Mercer has become a bit of a hero of the faith for me. That probably would offend him because he doesn't think he's in his 70s. He thinks he's a lot younger than that. But he's become a bit of a hero of the faith. One of the things I love about him is one of his 2 books that's kind of become famous or well known. The title of a mega church pastor's book is Not My Church. I mean, isn't that awesome? Like, I love this guy. And in the book, Not My Church, he says this about the Decapolis. He said, for the disciples, this wasn't just the wrong side of the tracks, it was the wrong side of life. And that's where Jesus is going to introduce us into what it looks like to share God. They do indeed get to the other side. Now, before they get to the other side, there's this storm that happens that Jesus calms in an incredible way. If you are not familiar with the story of Jesus, I'd encourage you to go back and read the end of chapter 4. As a matter of fact, if you don't know this story, you can go to our YouTube channel, go back to summer before last, where Chad Grounds talked about this story, not actually from this text, from Matthew's gospel. This is an incredible story, but we're more concerned for this morning about when he gets to the other side. He gets to the other side and it says immediately, that word immediately is used in every translation, he's confronted with a demon-possessed man. How's that for pagan occultic worship? The first person they immediately encounter is demon-possessed. Luke's gospel tells us he had not worn clothes in some time. So he wasn't just naked, he was naked. Luke also tells us he had had no home for a long time either. All 3 synoptic gospels tell us that he lived among the tombs. The dude was hanging out in a cemetery on purpose. Naked, not in his right mind, he's a tormented soul. As a matter of fact, we say that the text says that he would cry out night and day and cut himself. He's a tormented soul. Jesus doesn't even have time to get out of the boat. And this guy comes to him and says, why are you here? What do you want with me? Son of the Most High God. One of the first mouths to ever declare who Jesus really was a demon scared out of his mind. Son of the Most High God. So he says 2 interesting things. He calls Jesus the Son of the Most High God, and then he says, please don't torment me. This tormented guy is scared that Jesus would torment him. Jesus says, what is your name? He said, I am Legion, for we are many. Does that mean there were 6,000 demons in this guy? I don't know, but apparently he was pretty troubled up. And then something unique happens in this story that we don't see anywhere else in the miracles of Jesus. The demon negotiates for how he will be cast out, or how they will be cast out. And Jesus does something further unique. He invites farm animals into this exorcism. Jesus sends these demons into a herd of what was worshipped? Pigs that are nearby. It's quite the herd. This text tells us there was around 2,000 pigs. And the pigs have the demons cast into them, run down the cliff into the sea, and they drown. My friend Lamar Farrell says it was a bad day for the bacon business in the Decapolis that day. And now we pick up the story because we're getting to the point. Verse 14, the herdsmen, the people who had seen all this, the people whose pigs all just died, fled and told it in the city and in the country. People came to see what it was that had happened. When they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed, in his right mind, they were afraid. Isn't that interesting? This is not the point of this morning's talk. But can I just say, cultures that are opposed to the things of God, cultures that are opposed to biblical sexual ethics, cultures that are defined by their political views are probably going to be more afraid of the truth than they are going to be welcoming of the truth. They will actually see truth tellers as the most terrifying people in a culture. Anyways, I'm not sure if that shoe fits. Those who'd seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the poor pigs. And then the next two verses, we're going to see some begging taking place. They began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Not everybody who experiences the miracle-working presence of Jesus invites it into their life. As he's getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons, he did some begging too. He begged him that he might be with him. And the reason we started this conversation 2 weeks ago, the way we started this conversation, is so that we wouldn't be confused by this unique circumstance. We talked 2 weeks ago, if you remember, about the rubric of what it looks like to be a disciple or an apprentice of a rabbi. If a rabbi invites us to follow him, our life's mission is to be with him, to become like our rabbi, and then to do as our rabbi did. In this situation, though, he's skipping a step for our benefit. For us, we get to both be with Jesus and fulfill the rest of what we're about to read because he's given us his Spirit. That's why he told us, it's better for you that I go away. Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home. Go home. Remember, Luke told us he'd been homeless. And Jesus said, go back home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. This morning, as I was looking over my notes, the end of this verse had not stood out to me at all in my preparation. I told you for almost 2 years, I've been excited to talk to you about this. And it was this morning that I just stopped for a minute. And I was almost ashamed that I've read past this so quick because unfortunately that's been the narrative of my life. I've rushed past so much how much the Lord has done for me and how he has had mercy on me. And if we miss that part, none of the rest of this is going to make sense. He's been so good. And if that's true for you, man, has the Lord done something for you? Has he shown mercy to you? If that's true, then that means our calling to share the good news of that mercy starts at home. He says to everyone who's experienced his mercy, go home. Not yet, I have a lot more to say. Which is the whole heart and nucleus of our mission statement here. We take our mission statement and our core values from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel. So it begins with a community. That's where we connect with each other. Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. Know God intimately. As we know him informationally, theologically, he invites us to know him intimately and relationally. And if we know God, we can't help but flow to verse number 5. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. This consuming thing. These words I command you today shall be on your heart. That's good Hebrew language for it should change your life. And if indeed, as we connect with each other, we are growing to know God more intimately, we are growing to love God more passionately, we are connecting with each other more authentically, then nothing could possibly make more sense than verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children. If God is who he says he is, if he is as full of mercy as he claims to be, if he has done as much for us as he says, then we got to teach the next generation these glorious truths. That's nobody else's job. We say here all the time, it is not the job of this church to make disciples of Christians' kids. It is the job of this church to encourage, to cheerlead, to grab the brightest pom-poms we can find, to encourage and hold accountable parents as you make disciples of your kids. And for the parents who don't know where to start, the beauty of this verse is just talk. Just tell your kids, God's done so much for me. He's been merciful to me. Hey kids, where'd you see God at work today? Anybody got anything? Talk of them. Well, when could I possibly do that? I'm so glad you asked. When you sit in your house, which is biblical language for when you have a meal together, which we do far not often enough in our culture today. We are moving too much. Maybe we need to say no to some things so that we can actually sit in our house and have conversations that matter. We need the true giant walkout of the pandemic needs to be to some evening activities. But anyways, that's another talk. When you walk by the way, what's that look like? When you're driving in the Metroplex traffic, that's what that looks like. When you lie down and when you rise, that we would just have simple conversations about all that God has done for us. And then when our kids are raised, I don't think this commission ends. It means now we're helping make disciples of other people as they're making disciples of their kids. And it means that we're making disciples of kids whose parents didn't finish the job yet because the kid grew out of their house. Our son living in Florida, he ain't done being discipled, let me tell you. Thank God there's some adults who are talking to him. If some of you are watching this morning, we need you. As we come into an election year, there's a lot of people on both sides of political opposition who wish that Ronald Reagan would raise from the dead and serve a third term. And one of the things that made Ronald Reagan great, I was a child when he was, I don't remember his first election, but I do remember his second. And I just remember he was a uniter. He was a great communicator. And he was motivational, he was a vision caster, but he was a uniter. And this is what he said: all great change in America begins at the dinner table. And I would humbly and respectfully say your view is a little too small, President Reagan, because I believe all great change on planet Earth begins at whatever your culture's version is of a dinner table. See, he was a better communicator than me. That was way too long. That's how God designed it to be. And that's where this story of sharing God begins. Go home and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Now, what's interesting about this text is it says, go home to your friends. Does that read strange to you? If you're reading from a different translation, that's the ESV, says go home to your friends. The New American Standard says go home to your people. The New Living Translation says go home to your family. Now that reads a little more logical. The question becomes, which is correct? Is it go home to your friends, your people, or your family? And the answer is yes. D, all of the above. Do you know why the translators struggled with what word to put there? Because that word's not actually in the original Greek text. The way this actually reads is, go home to yours. Just go home to the people that you call yours, whoever that is. The way for us to really understand what this means is to really understand the word home here in the text. This is where we're actually finally getting to where I've been excited to get to. So this morning, you're going to learn a Greek word that you already know. The word home in this text is the Greek word oikos. Anybody ever had oikos Greek yogurt? Yes. So they're like, hey, we have Greek yogurt, let's pick a Greek word. And they Googled what's Greek for home, and oikos was the answer, and they named their Greek yogurt oikos. But it doesn't just mean home, it barely means home the way we use the word. It for sure doesn't mean the structure, and it for sure doesn't mean 4.2 people and a dog. As a matter of fact, in our culture today, the American family keeps shrinking. We are having less kids, and marriages are lasting for a shorter time period. And so the American household keeps becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller number, and that is not what oikos means. Because oikos actually means more than just the people who can fit under your roof. It's the extended household. It's the 8 to 15 people that are yours. Your friends, your family, your people. Your oikos. Jesus is calling us to share the story of God with our oikos. And not just in this text. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus meets a wee little man. They talked about that in Temple Kids last Sunday. By the way, parents, that's one of the ways we reinforce you making disciples of your kids, is that's why you get a discussion guide sent home with you, a parent guide every week. You're like, I don't know what questions to ask. Great, we'll put some in writing and hand them to you every Sunday. Zacchaeus invites Jesus, well, Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house, technically. That's rude, don't do that. Jesus is allowed to. They have a meal together, and what Jesus proclaims before he leaves the house is, today, salvation has come to this oikos. In John chapter 4, the official son is healed, and it says, he and his oikos believed in him. In Acts chapter 10, the first Gentile to be invited into this thing called ecclesia, the church, Peter receives a vision to take the gospel to a dude named Cornelius, and he responds in faith, and it says he and his whole oikos became believers that day. It goes on in Acts chapter number 16, the gospel goes to Philippi. A woman named Lydia responds to the gospel, and it says her and her household believed and were baptized. And then later in the same chapter, a Philippian jailer says, what must I do to be saved? Places his faith in Jesus, says that he and his oikos believed and were baptized. This is the model. This is the method. Tom Mercer said the same tactical approach to changing the world has happened from one generation to the next, from one decade to the next, from one century to the next, from one millennia to the next. This is still how people hear about Jesus, is that we reach our oikos with the good news and then train them to reach their oikos. And train them to reach their oikos. And train them to reach their oikos until we find ourselves in 2024 hoping somebody else might reach our oikos. Who are the people in our oikos? The language Tom Mercer uses all the time is, who are the people on the front row of your life? Last week we took our 12th graders to New York City. We went to 2 Broadway shows. We did not sit on the front row. Matter of fact, the first show we went to, we actually sat on the last row in the upper mezzanine. But there are certain people in your life who naturally sit on the front row. They're the people who have the closest access to see your life. Now let's just, P.S., we are not the stars of the show. This is not the story of us. We are not actually on the stage. But in this context, it's all about Jesus. In this context, though, as you're doing life, there's 8 to 15 people who know what's up with you. I've heard Tom Mercer say this now several times as we've had the privilege of getting to speak together. He says, if you had the technical ability, the technology existed, where you could tell the whole world in one moment, I am an apprentice of Jesus Christ and he's changed my life. If in one moment you could tell the whole world that you're a follower of Jesus, and instantly it would be translated into the heart language of every single human being on planet Earth. In one moment, 8.1 billion people could hear you say, I am a follower of Jesus. There's really only 8 to 15 people who would know if you're telling the truth. And that's your oikos. Isn't that cool? That's who Jesus sent this guy to. Go to your oikos. The 8 to 15 people are our first mission field, and quite frankly, our most effective mission field. It looks different for all of us in different seasons of life, but that's where God has placed it. And here's why that's so important. I'm pausing so that you'll understand the significance of what I'm about to say. Here's why this is so important. 95% of people who come to know Christ come because of the direct influence of a friend or family member. 95%. You're not hearing me. Okay. Imagine I told you that there is now a cure for cancer that is 95% effective no matter where you're from on planet Earth. Do you think we should be putting a lot of effort into making that treatment accessible to everybody in the world? There are people lobbying to be like, this should be free. If there was a treatment for diabetes that was 95% effective, if there was actually a diet plan that was 95% effective, maybe you're a sports person, whatever your sport is. Let's say you're a baseball player, and I were to tell you that 95% of all Cy Young winners in the history of Major League Baseball came from the same small town. Right? We'd be spending major money flying to that town, testing the water, looking for the power lines, trying to figure out how their parents met, where are they from, right? For 2,000 years, the science has played out that 95% of people who come to know Jesus because somebody was in their oikos who was a follower of Jesus. That's profound to me. So, let's see if we're in the normal range. How many of you in this room came to know Jesus because of the direct influence of a friend or a family member? Raise your hand. That looks like 95% to me. Well done. So that's not my mom's story. My mom, a stranger, knocked on the door and told her the gospel story, right? So she's always been a little different. No, seriously. But because she was outside the 95%, I'm inside the 95%. 95%, this is how the gospel has gone from generation to generation. We hear a lot of negative things about China these days. We're worried about their technology. We're worried about their economy and our ties to it. But this morning, I want to talk about the church in China. Because the reality is, as Americans, we should be envious, jealous, and hungry to learn from the church in China today. Because it's exploding in a way we've not witnessed in modern history. As a matter of fact, to see a place where the church advanced this much, we have to go back to the book of Acts. And today, in China, Christian assemblies are either banned or highly monitored based on where you live. And yet the church is exploding. Why? Because people are saying, if the church can't reach my oikos, I will. And we will gather in my home around the Word of God and study it together. Back in 1949, we're told that there was only about 500,000 baptized evangelical known Christians when it was legal. About 500,000. The reason that's important is the most recent estimates of people with boots on the ground believe there's over 130 million baptized, identifying evangelical followers of Jesus in China. By the way, the same is true in Iran and in most of the Middle East and Northern Africa. The church is thriving in the world where we would least expect it. Every headline that I read, because social media knows I'm a pastor because it's creepy what they know about us, so they're always sending me church recommendations of articles and blogs. Every article I read talks about how church attendance is in decline in the United States. And I'm just telling you, that's not true in most of the world. Places where there is no machine or moving lights or awesome bands, there's just people who are compelled to reach their oikos for the glory of God in their generation. I don't know about you. I'm glad God has not called me to go live in China and reach a different oikos. I'm not a big fan of persecution. Thank you. I've never been like, man, I wish the government would oppress my faith. It's actually kind of terrifying. Tom Mercer said this: if you share the same aversion to prison time that I do, here's some good news. It isn't persecution that generates growth. It's the ministry model that political oppression actually forces us to embrace. Political opposition forces the church to not be dependent on a campus or a program or a ministry staff. Political oppression and opposition forces believers to just share the oikos in their orbit, the story of Jesus. So let me tell you about the first time I ever met Tom Mercer. We were still kind of getting back to normal from the pandemic. It was over a year and a half ago. And I had the privilege of speaking at a conference with Tom Messer and Tom Mercer. And I never got their names wrong because I just called them Pastor Tom. Tom Mercer, I told you, pastored in California. So he was still living in the lockdown a year and a half ago. And yet he was seeing a bit of a gospel explosion in California because believers in California were becoming less dependent on their church to reach their friends and family because the church couldn't invite them to campus. They just started sharing the gospel with their oikos during the pandemic. So he was speaking at a church. When I met him 3 weeks before that, he had been speaking at a church about oikos. That's what he's been talking about for 50 years. And during a break, a couple nurses came up to him and asked him, "Have you ever heard of R naught?" And because he's 70 years old and only has dad jokes, he said, "I are not familiar with that." It's R subscript 0 is R naught. These nurses started to explain to him that it's how we measure the transmission of any infection, which at that time we were paying a lot of attention to. It's how we measure the transmittability of an infectious agent. It's called the reproduction number of a virus. The higher the R naught, the more contagious the virus. The higher the R naught, the more people I will give this to if I get it. Does that make sense? So if I get this, what's the likelihood I'm going to give it to other people? Every virus has a range attached to it, which affects the likelihood that should you be infected, a certain number of other people will catch it from you, unless measures are taken to mitigate contact. So the R naught measures your contagiousness unless measures are taken to mitigate contact. All diseases and viruses have an R naught that people way smarter than me have studied. But here's what Tom Mercer taught me. An R naught is determined by 3 variables. How do you determine how many people are going to catch this from you? The R naught is determined by, number 1, duration. How long have I been infected and will I remain infectious? Duration. Number 2, proximity. How close to other individuals am I? And then number 3 is frequency. How often will personal connections occur? Every virus has an R naught. That's determined by how long has this thing been in me, how close are people to me, and how often are we having contact. The R naught for the standard flu is 2. When COVID first started becoming a pandemic, the R naught for COVID, the first round, was only 2 to 3. And I'm going to say some things that might trigger you, but the Delta variant, anybody shiver, for COVID was 6 to 7. And then there was Omicron, which was 3 to 5 times that in R naught. The R naught for the measles, depending on where you live in the world, is 12 to 18. And Tom Mercer would tell you that the R naught for the gospel of Jesus Christ is 8 to 15. If you are in Christ for any duration of time, and if there are people in your proximity with whom you have frequent exposure, then you are called to make disciples of 8 to 15 people. Let's be contagious for the glory of God. The gospel is generally transmitted relationally. Should you give your life to Christ, a certain number of other people should catch the Christian faith from you. Unless Measures are taken to mitigate contact. And here's where the American church has failed in our growth. As the American church, with all of our affluence, has turned this into a professional endeavor where we watch from the platform, where people are expected to be better communicators than the next guy, and where the musicians are supposed to be better than the church down the street. We've outsourced the advancement of the gospel to the professionals, and we are losing our contagiousness in our generation. Sociologists tell us that evangelicalism, conservative Christianity, is growing in the United States at the rate today of 0.08%. The problem with that data is that was before the pandemic. And I'm afraid the number's lower than that. 0.8%, where we see the gospel exploding in oppressed parts in the world. One of the questions that gets asked in every election cycle is how many Americans go to church? There's actually a debate among church scholars about what that number is. The media will tell you 40%, probably 42%, 41%. But there's such a thing as, it's called the halo effect, meaning when you're asked, do you go to church? If you kind of used to, you say yes, because we tend to put a halo on our own behavior. The better data is it's closer to like 18% of Americans go to church, which is still great compared to most of the world. But this is a big number during election cycle. How many Americans go to a place of faith? And then we're going to argue about whether it's 20% or 40%. My friend Tom Mercer would say the answer is close to 100%. Because if people get up in the morning and go to a workplace where a believer lives, they're encountering the church of Jesus Christ. If they have a family member who walks with Jesus, then they attend church at every family reunion if they're near you. This is what he says. Church isn't some place you go, it's someone you know. And then the church gathers together on the first day of the week to celebrate the resurrected Lord, for sure. I'm not minimizing the role of the church. Obviously, kind of like I like when you're here. But the reality is 100% of Americans probably go to church every week because we've been commissioned into their lives. They're in our oikos. These 8 to 15 people are in a lot of different stages of their faith and their life, and we're going to explore together over these weeks, how do I find out and see my oikos? How do I know who they are? So really quick, we're almost done. Let me give you these 4 things. And again, this is from Mercer. Here's 4 ways you can begin to think through who are the 8 to 15 people on the front row of my life. Here's how he describes these different versions of the oikos. Number 1, he calls them pre-Christians. Now this is alliterated, they all start with P, but I still love that phrase. The idea that anybody who's not a Christian has the potential to become one. You follow that? Anybody? I think that's cool. Anyways, pre-Christian. So what is our role? That we would share the gospel with them, that we would evangelize them. That's our calling. That's our responsibility if in our oikos they are pre-Christian. Number 2 is purposeful. Man, they are on mission, following Jesus, apprenticing with their rabbi, and our role in that is just to encourage them. Hey, keep chasing Jesus. Let's keep running after him together. Let's be with him, become more like him, and let's do what he did. Number 3 are prodigal oikos. Those who have drifted, have grown cold, have unconfessed sin in their life, are wounded maybe, for whatever reason, they're not walking with God, and what they need is to be energized. Somebody to grab a hold of them and say, man, let's walk back together to the Father's house. And then there's what he calls potentials. Potentials are people not in your oikos who could be with a little effort. Like maybe it's that coworker I've never really spoken to, so I don't have any idea where they are with Jesus. So maybe we should go to lunch together one day. Maybe we should invite him to go to Top Golf together or whatever it is that you enjoy doing. That we should explore how to engage them with the story of the gospel. Over the next few weeks, we're going to try to figure out who's my oikos, And where do they fit in this? According to their, not that we're labeling them, where do they say they belong in this journey? I want to end this morning not with a story that's meaningful to me or a sermon illustration. I want to end this morning by coming back to the narrative in the text. Back to this guy who wanted so bad to be with Jesus, and Jesus said, no, go home. Tell him what God's done for you and the mercy he has shown for you. So look back at our text, Mark chapter 5, verse number 20. He went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone who was afraid now marveled. Isn't that cool? They were afraid of Jesus, but they marveled at somebody with a testimony of life change. That's profound to me. In the Gospel of Mark here, that's kind of where this story ends. But we get a hint from the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus came back to the Decapolis again. As a matter of fact, look at two verses 30 and 31 of Matthew chapter 15. Great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put them at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered. They went from afraid to marveling to wondering. When they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, the blind seeing, life change in Jesus. And then look what they did. They glorified the God of Israel, and that's why we reach our oikos with the gospel. They went from afraid to marveling to wondering to glorifying the King of Kings. That's the point of reaching our oikos in our generation, in our little corner of the world, is that God might be glorified among us. What happened? One guy experienced life change in Jesus and went to his oikos and told them how much the Lord had done for him and the mercy that he had shown to him. Friend, the call to you and I is no different. I've never known anybody who had to have a legion of demons cast out of them. But I do know a lot of people who would say, my life was out of control before I met Jesus. And I believe the mercy he's shown to us and the great things he's shown for us are not just for us to enjoy, but for us to steward for the sake of reaching our oikos with the gospel of Jesus Christ.